And I would like to do things a little bit differently than Roger runs them. So I will give an introduction to the essay for today, and then I would like us to have a discussion. So I don't think I'm qualified to answer all of the questions that people have. And I think, especially for this essay, because it's nice and short and it offers some sort of like rubbing points, if you will, it would be nice to have a discussion of Hannah Arendt's vision of politics that's at work here. So the essay that we read for today is called The Minority Question, and it's actually not an essay. It's an excerpt from a letter to the leftist lawyer Erich Cohn-Bendit from the summer of 1940. In the summer of 1940, Arendt and her husband, Heinrich Blücher, are in France. And they get a sort of a brief respite from their sort of from their journeys across Europe and then eventually to the US, of course, which gives Hannah Arendt a chance to think about the future of Europe. And this, I think it's an interesting fact to, that alone is an interesting fact to sort of like state and contemplate that she takes this opportunity to think about Europe, of all things. She's reading Proust, and she's still thinking about anti-Semitism, so she's continuing in the vein of the other essays we've read. And of course, she doesn't know at this point that the worst is yet to come in a way. France will shortly thereafter fall, and the persecution of Jews will start in collaboration with the Nazis. The question of statelessness and of the so-called Jewish question, and in the broader way in which Arendt comes to think about it, so related to the problem of the nation state, gains increasing urgency in this context. And I think we can also speculate that this does have something to do with her internment in the Camp Ghoul just shortly before that. So in May 1940, she's interned in Ghoul and is there for, I believe, a couple of months. Not that long, but long enough to give her a taste, so to speak, of the camp experience. But characteristically, I think, the camp experience does not lead Hannah Arendt to write about her suffering or to give testimony of that experience, but to speak about the danger of political apathy, really, and the danger of trusting in the wrong people, in the wrong institutions. So the text of The Minority Question from this memo to Erich Cohn-Bendit is a letter that was then substantially integrated into Origins later on into the anti-Semitism chapter. And I think if we wanted to sort of sum it up in 2 words, we could say that the minority question makes the argument of solidarity instead of minority rights on the one hand, and of federation instead of nation on the other hand. So let me walk you through some of the sort of highlights in the actual text. She starts with diagnosing both of the major Jewish forces and organizations involved in the peace talks after the First World War with a kind of resistance to politics. So both the Zionists and the Eastern European representatives place their hope in the nation rather than in the fact of the Jewish people, according to her. And that's, if you want to look on page 126, there is this pithy kind of passage where she writes in the middle, the goal of all legislation concerning minorities was to depoliticize minorities, for which cultural autonomy seemed the appropriate instrument. It has often been said that the Jews are the minority par excellence because they lack a motherland, a statement that is true at least to the extent that they were the only existing minority that could be completely depoliticized because they lacked the one political factor that, regardless of all legislative definitions, inevitably politicizes a minority, a homeland, a motherland. So in her analysis, it is because of this misguided hope in the nation that the Jewish delegates fail to realize the potential of organizing Jews as Jews. If you look at the bottom of 126, she kind of imagines another possible version of how history could have gone if they had realized the potential of a kind of global coalition of Jews. So at the bottom of the page, she writes, what might have been said was, we who have been granted the right to a national homeland in Palestine demand the rights of a national minority in all the other countries of the world. These minorities will be protected by an organization of our own making, an elected body and thus something more than a comité de délégation juive. On the other hand, we demand that you help us in Palestine by importing, etc., tax policies. It then would have been very clear to everyone that whoever strikes at Palestine is also at the very least striking at those Jews who have been recognized as minorities, and whoever strikes at the Gola strikes at Palestine. So the organization of world Jewry would have had to be protected, she then argues and adds to that, by a kind of European commonwealth. And here, I think Arendt shows that the question of minority rights is really the question of the crisis of the nation state. The phenomenon of statelessness in particular, which she points out, I think first in this essay, shows that the problem isn't that of a few minorities who will then eventually be reintegrated into a nation state, but the inability of the nation state to absorb or to integrate minorities in any kind of meaningful way. So, and this is where she says, without being a majority somewhere, a minority's rights aren't guaranteed by anyone in our current system. So this is the kind of like jumping off point for her to say, we need to think about belonging in new ways. That's on page 130. Where she, on the one hand, she says at the top of the page, our fate can only be bound up with that of other small European peoples. And then a little bit further down in the same paragraph, there may soon come a time when the idea of belonging to a territory is replaced by the idea of belonging to a commonwealth.
Okay.
Sorry about that. So a new way of thinking about belonging to a territory. And by extension, we might think about how Hannah Arendt is thinking about this new political organization. So maybe the first question that I want to throw into the round here is, what vision of a political organization does she articulate here? And at the same time, I would like to have, if people are interested in doing that, a kind of, maybe even a kind of meta conversation about what kind of analysis work she's doing here. So what kind of line is she treading here? How does she think about particularity versus universalism, if you will? Okay. So I will leave you with that, and I look forward to what people thought about this essay.
Could you say the second part again?
Yeah. Basically, how does her analysis work? What is the relationship between particularism, so her attention to difference, and claims on the universal? Hmm? Yes, Charles.
Take a stab at it. I mean, clearly federation is her alternative to the nation state as the sole way of protecting minorities. And it made me think about the European Union and, what she would have thought of that, which is interesting. As she sometimes does, she throws out things without elaborating in detail what that would look like. And in terms of the second question, I never thought she was a great advocate for universalism. I mean, I think she thought of that as, the idea of humanity or human rights as abstract, and really the Jews had to, I mean, it seems like a theme throughout this book, that Jews have to protect themselves and fight for themselves as Jews. And she at one point advocates a Jewish army or some kind of army to be deployed. So my sense is that it's about particularity really more than this abstract idea of humanity or universal human rights. So that's where I would maybe tentatively place that.
But there are also ways in which he holds on to maybe a kind of universal, not the universal of human rights, but there is, there is the call for solidarity, which sort of like is an appeal to a different, maybe universal is the wrong way. I don't know what.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it seems like this idea of solidarity is a banding together maybe of various groups who still retain some sense of particularity at the same time. Like I said, with much of art, it's not always clear. But yeah, I don't know what else to say other than that. But I mean, it's also, even throughout in the human condition, there is this idea of human. I mean, she's always treading this fine line, right? So there's no such thing as human nature, but there's human conditions. There's some kind of ethic inherent in plurality, but she doesn't want some kind of universal ethics on the one hand. So she's trying to find this middle ground. And it's always, I find, it's interesting, but it's also just hard to pin down at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Victus, do you want to take over? You're mute.
Sorry. I think, to me, it seems like she's talking about different levels. You have individuality, and then she talks about this Jews as a people, and she talks about minorities, different minorities. And I think, so there is some kind of grouping some people together. At the same time, I think she would, in a way, always have these people to keep their individuality. So there is, in a way, how to make these people as a people be represented. And I guess there has to be some kind of organizing minorities, but giving them a voice. Like she says in this federation, I think she says that you have kind of representatives from the Jews in it, in spite of them maybe not having their own land. And I sometimes, it's a question about what is this people. And I thought she says, which I wondered a little bit about on page, at the bottom of page 128, culture without politics, that is without history and a national context, becomes backbid folkloristics and folk barbarism. I'm just gonna let my dog out.
I mean, I think this is a super interesting question that you raised of asking what is her idea of a people here, right? Because there's so many places in the essay where she's like, it's not this, it's not this, it's not this. So to ask like, what is the people for her? And on the other hand, what I found interesting you pointed to was the problem of representation, right? Is this a representational idea that she's promoting here? Is this actually about sort of like a group of delegates representing the people? Or is there some kind of, I feel like there's some kind of other there's an almost anti-representational thinking at work here already, I think.
Yes, I wonder, but yeah, maybe. I think it's really, it's difficult to find out. And I wonder what she means by this, when she says culture without politics, and that is without history and national context. That means in a way, if you don't have politics, then you're out without history and national context. So I don't know. I wrote in the chat last time. I find it. I mean, the Jewish question is very special, but you have minorities, other kind of minorities as well, and. Like, for instance, in Norway, we have the Sami people, and they have gone through this kind of first assimilation politics in Norway, where they were forced to learn Norwegian, trying to ignore the culture and kind of deny them having their own culture. But then it went back in the 80s, 90s over to kind of politics of integration. And that means they have their own cultural right. They have even their own parliament in Norway. To kind of having their own language, their own culture. And the same is, the Sami people lives in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and part of Russia. And also Sweden and Finland, they've got their own parliament. So they have elected people to the parliament, and they decide on behalf of the Sami people. So in a way, when you have this, you have, in a way, they have a culture, they have a tradition, but they have also the possibility to make changes, because all people changes as the world changes and we develop and new things come in. But they also have some cultural rights they have as a minority, and as they are called indigenous people here. So, and actually not long ago, there was this Supreme Court that made a judgment that the decision from the Norwegian government to build windmills in the area where the reindeer is grazing, that was a violation of the Sami people's cultural right, because they are traditionally reindeer herders. So there is something there. And I wonder, I have a problem if you don't have different levels. How do you, I mean, you can't have every Jew to have their rights in this. And how do she picture the Jews' representation in, for instance, the federation? I think it's a lot of difficult questions, and I'm not sure at all about how. And for instance, also, what is, when she talks about the Jewish people, how does she see that compared to what we call different ethnicities? Ethnicity is also, she's very critical to race, and that is something different. So, yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think, yeah, it's very special. you have to keep something, and for the Jews to keep their identity, they have to have some representation to take care of their culture, and that goes for every minority, I think. For instance, with the Sami people, if they never had been integrated, if they just had get on with this politics of assimilation, they would have lost their language. They would have lost much of the culture. So this is also, there is something to take care of in this being a people. Just some thoughts to, yeah, put into.
I mean, I wonder, she motions in a still kind of abstract way, as she admits, towards something, the national alliance that she speaks of on page 132, where it almost sounds to me like the councils of the Weimar Republic, that kind of idea of organizing people in professional organizations, and then forming self-defense units based on on those kind of professional councils. But yeah, Hannah, you're mute. You're still mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, so I said, I think, this is a somewhat amorphous essay, and the audience is sort of an uncertain audience, is she proposing anything particularly concrete? In terms of it being concrete, she says on page 132, in any case without an all-inclusive Jewish organization. So I think she's calling for Jews to be represented worldwide as Jews, not by grouping geographically, but worldwide. She's calling for that. She's, throughout her life, she's calling for a homeland, not a homeland, a state, not a state, I think. But here she's somewhat calling for Palestine potentially as a state. She says, because a minority, that you can only, a people can be a minority somewhere only if they're a majority elsewhere. That's what she's saying. So it seems like she's calling for something like a European Union. She does not make it at all clear. I would love to have the history of what exactly happened in the negotiations in World War I that she's talking about. I would love if somebody had, in terms of minorities, because it isn't very clear what was discussed. And if anybody has any background on that, it would interest me. But in terms of concrete, what is she saying concretely? I think what I've just said is what she is saying concretely, which is that there needs to be like a world Zionist organization. She mentions that at the very beginning of the essay. Why didn't they use that? That was already in existence, she asks. So why didn't they, she says it occurred to none of them to make use of the World Zionist Organization, the sole Jewish political organ recognized by the great powers, etc. So, yeah. But, I think it would be very interesting to see where this comes out of in terms of what she's referring to specifically in terms of the negotiations about minorities, at the conclusion of World War I, because it's not really very well articulated here. It's taken for granted. Also, I have one question, which is, I don't know what the Gola is.
It's the Jewish people in the diaspora.
That's it?
Yeah, I believe so.
That's
Unless
one
somebody
word for
says
it. Oh, okay.
Arkavan.
So I have a little bit like just saying what I understood from this chapter, and just like a question to all to see if I am right in that. So I think what I understood from this chapter is mostly it's a like self reflection about all the thoughts, all the options that the Jewish people had during that time, and thinking about if any of them really a valid option to follow by the political leaders. Because Hannah Arendt here, like questioning the Jewish delegations that they are acted and spoke without actually being rooted in the Jewish people. In one hand, also she's skeptical about how we can get our minority rights. In one hand, if we try to be part of a federation or a European federation, or should we follow to have a motherland or the homeland that we are a majority there. So she is like thinking and collecting all those ideas and options that she thought about them, or she saw in the practical political arena in that time, and trying to figure out and discuss with the others that she sent a letter to see what should we do. So I feel some type of confusion, even though she's usually skeptical and not deciding or directly suggesting a concrete solution, because it's a huge, it's a Jewish question. It is not something easy, especially that time. So I think here she's just more demonstrating that confusion and asking for clarity from herself and others too, to see what to follow, what's the right way, what's the right path for them. Am I right in that? Or I really like to just get some ideas about this. Thank you.
That makes sense to me.
Did anyone want to add something to Hannah's question about the minority treaties?
The history.
Only that I had the same question, but I did want to respond to something that Hannah brought up. I think I was next anyway. Yeah. This phrase is used a couple times and people have mentioned it a few times, so it struck you guys as much as it did me. The people can be a minority somewhere only if they are a majority elsewhere. So here's my claim is that's just a slight euphemism for basically as a minority, any national minority is going to get mistreated unless there's someone to stand up for them, right? And so obviously, so in other words, basically it's going to be the threat of action from an external political player that's basically going to keep that minority in a good place. And so that's why then the Jews sort of relinquishing their international organization for national minorities was a foolhardy move. I mean, that seems like I just sort of took that to be understood that she didn't want to put it quite that baldly, but she basically all the pictures are there, all the pieces are there. So I'm just wondering if I'm wrong and there's another way to see that. But I do think we need to decode that phrase though, because it's used several times.
No, I mean, I think that sounds right. I think the context of the minority treaties is precisely that, right? The attempt after the First World War to guarantee national minorities' rights by creating these special treaties for them. And then what happens is that that sort of, in her analysis, is that, you know, their rights cannot be guaranteed by appeal to a kind of United Nations, because first of all, there isn't really one, and second of all, it's not enforceable, right? So what happens in the fallout of that is, as she references here on 130, horrible relocations of peoples and various massacres, right? Like, so preceding the Holocaust, there are already all of these examples of minorities being persecuted, the most famous example being the Armenians, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Another Jeff.
No, that was me.
Oh, okay. Jeff with picture now. Great.
I have to admit, I read ahead a little bit, and some of this your question may be answered a little bit later on, where she talks about an army of Jewish people.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that's cheating a little bit, but that's one of the places she goes.
And she gestures towards that already, no? I mean, she uses the word units of defense or something like that. Towards the end.
It was a Jewish legion under British command.
Right. I can't find it at the moment, but there is a gesturing towards that. Other things that people noticed about this essay. I mean, I think part of the question that Arkawan raised is like, how clear is this, right, as a political vision? I would almost say that I mean, to me, it's pretty clear, although very complex, right? There's this kind of line that she's treading where she's saying, not this, not this, not this, but to me, the direction of her critique is relatively sane and clear at this moment. I don't know how other people read the essay.
Well, how would you sum it up then?
Like I said, the idea of sort of federation versus nation, and solidarity instead of minority. And then we can talk about her vision of politics that's at stake here, right? Because I think, I mean, you know, intervene if you think that this is completely misguided, but I think what I meant to suggest when I said anti-representational politics is that what she's outlining here is not this kind of organization where a few of what she keeps calling the nobles, right? Is that what she calls it?
There are the nobles, and also there's the American Jews are poised to become.
Yes, exactly.
That's surprising.
Exactly. So I think what she's trying to do here, or sort of like what goes on underneath her understanding of how political self-organization should work, is something of a critique of this idea that a few kind of select educated Jews could represent national minorities, right? So she's both critical of the idea of national representation, but I would also argue of the idea of representation overall, because at the places where she suggests a kind of alternative, it is to say this the organization of people as the whole people, right? And I'm really curious what all of you think. What would that look like? Solidarity for the people as a whole, right? She has this emphasis on not on representation, which is the idea that one person stands for many, but on bringing kind of like everyone into politics, right? And this is also at work when she speaks about the politicization of the Eastern European Jewish masses, right? Any ideas on that?
I think that it's very important that she is aware of the difficulty of uniting within the minority, that the Eastern point of view is very different from the Zionist point of view. And this follows her throughout many of her writings, how to develop a more unified point of view. It plagues her even with the Eichmann book and in many of her concerns. I'm not sure if I'm saying it correctly, but like Martin Buber, early in his life, is very much of one mindset, but then throughout his life, he completely switches to a different mindset regarding the Jewish point of view. And I think that's an important part of this reading, that she is demonstrating her own uncertainty about how to create a unity within a minority. I don't know if that's relevant, but it was interesting to me.
On that point about her state of mind and how far she's willing to go, I'm surprised no one's mentioned the top of 131. This really, I mean, it must have been stressful. But you talked about the timeline a little bit, but I'm just wondering. I thought Paris fell like in the spring, so maybe it was later. But it had to be a very stressful time. The first prerequisite for such organizing is for us to be rid of all those Jews who do not want to be Jews. Like, whoa. And then the rest of the paragraph is just as strong. I guess I won't read it out. But what that's kind of it doesn't sound like the Arendt we know from later.
Exactly. It's very strange. It is totally unrealistic, and it's also strange, I think.
How so?
What would it? I mean, it just seems like an outlier. Like, what would it do politically with what she's talking about? It's just, I don't know. I thought it was very weird. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. It's just not something you would ordinarily go about doing, taking a test of loyalty or patriotism, or, what I'm saying? How do you do it? Take this litmus test? I mean, it just seems out of the arena of.
Well, it's kind of, I mean, it is, virtual traitors. I mean, it is harsh,
Right.
but she's saying, but we can only be glad of that. So I think that her thing is we've got to be able to act, and as long as there's too many of us that are of mixed feelings, that are trying to still assimilate or something, then we won't be able to do that. So they need to go their way, and we'll go our way. So it's sort of, it is about solidarity, but it doesn't mean that a given set of people have to be there. There just needs to be some set of people that have a feeling of solidarity in order that something can be done. Because I think clearly what she's agonizing over is the fact that we're not doing anything, right? And the next one is the war that we're not having, right? So that's
So what's
Susan, yeah.
what's confusing me is that I guess last week or the week before, we were talking about this idea that there was no cultural or religious unity of being a Jew. This had all been destroyed according to Arendt. I disagreed with it, but according to her, this was all destroyed during the Enlightenment. And now she's calling for unity and solidarity among Jews. So I'm really confused by that. And the other piece for me that was helpful is I think what she's saying on page 128, I think it is, where she talks about that the assimilation happened as a result of the French Revolution, and that process has now come to an end. And that it's being reversed. And so it's helpful for me to look at that and say, okay, so that's how we wound up in this situation, talking about minorities, because assimilation didn't work. and now we're dealing with minorities. But then, it's still confusing for me that, these were supposedly people who had no culture or religion, and now and that the Zionists created fabricated this idea of what it was to be a Jew, that really it was complete fabrication, and now she's calling for unity and solidarity.
So what makes the Jews now in this text?
Yeah, what's the litmus test?
Yeah, and she's saying, and all those who don't want to be, so long.
I really think that is symptomatic of, I think it's an emotional thing she's saying, a kind of rare, not very intellectual, but more emotional thing, because it's 1940 and she's on the cusp of total horror. And that's what I think.
I mean, but I think she was consistent with that throughout her life, that about Jews are Jews and they have to recognize that. And it's a sort of presages some of the whole things in Rahel Varnhagen about, the parvenu and the pariah and so on. I mean, that was an issue that was very close to her heart, of assimilation. And she seemed to almost despise these people who would, assimilate. And although, as my understanding is that she was not religious at all.
She wasn't religious at all.
But I think she considered her Jewish identity very important to her throughout her life.
Well, she actually didn't think it was good or bad.
But I mean,
I
think she's pretty consistent in that. I'm saying I don't see this as different than other stuff she said, personally.
I think she was.
Do we need the hand signals, maybe? Yeah. I'm sensing a bit sort of chaos impinging on us. Yes, please.
Okay, I think, well, she's talked about she was born a Jew. And at least until recently, it has something with you are a Jew if your mother is a Jew. Isn't that? Because it has the same is actually for the Sami people, I see. They are belonging to the Sami people if they have parents who are in the Sami people. And Arendt herself has said several times she is a Jew. She would never deny it. She was not a religious Jew, but she would never deny. And even her mother would have slapped her in the face if she denied being a Jew, as she says. So there is something in it that she is actually born a Jew, and because that's some kind of identity. And I don't know, she also says this, that see the Jews as a nation, as she says, within such a commonwealth, we could be recognized as a nation and be represented in European Parliament. So she sees Jews as a people and as a nation. She was born a Jew. That's also a clear element in her thinking. But she was against nation states. She's very clear very often. And I think also in this, the trouble is when you combine together the nation and the state. So there is something, at least she says many times this of the Jewish people, they belong to a nation, but they have not their own state. She wouldn't have them to have their own nation state. She's born a Jew. When she says this, to get rid of all those Jews who do not want to be Jews, it might be in that she says it's in this framework, continuing from this, that they could be recognized as a nation and be represented in the European Parliament. So she writes that it is in this framework that I see the organized units that are called for to be very sure the very existence of the Jewish people would then depend on them. And I think it's after she has said this on top of 138, she comes to this first prerequisite for such organizing is first to be rid of all those Jews who do not want to be Jews. So it's in a way, if you can't have with you people who don't want to be a Jew. I mean, she was very clear that she was a Jew. That was a fact. She could never deny a fact like that. So in a way, maybe she's thinking of that. If people don't want to be seen as Jew, don't want to tell them that they're Jew, if they feel ashamed of being it, so just get rid of them. They can't do anything good for us as a people, as a nation. Well, at least that's my thoughts. So on this.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah, Susan, I think you were next.
Yeah, just for me, the clearest statement she makes, somewhere in something I read, she says, I belong to them. For me, that said it all.
Jeff?
Yeah, I'm basically agreeing, and also with oh, I lost the name now. If you fall off the screen, I forget you. But it's different mostly in the way that she's kind of losing her cool a little bit. I think that's what, but in terms of the conceptually, I think it is of a piece with what she did later about plurality. And in order to be part of the plurality, you have to be different so that you can be counted as another one, right? so you got to keep your different. And I think yeah, basically being a Jew is something that she was. She didn't endeavor to be it other than just to accept it and accept it as a fact of her difference, right? And so that was, and everyone's got something like that, right? You just things that you were given, you know, in sort of the Heideggerian sense. Yeah, that's just what you are. But then you take that in, and then you have another side of you that is, you know, one of the polity, right? And that's where the rationalist angle comes in. And I think she was that rationalist equanimity was ruffled a bit there towards the end of this essay.
C. Nolan Hudson.
Which, by the way, it's not it was an essay, but it was called from a letter. So probably when she wrote those words originally, she was speaking to one person.
I have unmuted myself. Can you hear me? This is a little off the subject, but Ken Burns' three-part series, America and the Holocaust, got me thinking about this. We saw it on our public television here in Jackson, Mississippi. And I guess what I'm about to get to is, what kind of experience do Jewish people have today in the world in which they live? And I'm thinking about the anti-Semitic prevalence within culture, within society. And I felt very unsettled, I go back and forth here, unsettled by what Ken Burns did, particularly on the last segment. As a retired surgeon, I saw my share of trauma, but I wasn't prepared for what I saw in some of the images that Ken Burns put out. It was absolutely, I mean, it was horrifying. And I had trouble sleeping that night because it was, I mean, I had never seen such a conglomeration of poor souls that were dead and piled up, like, as some people have referred to as cordwood. And it just really bothered me. But also what bothered me was how Roosevelt had to tiptoe around the subject of, we are devoting all of these various means to protect Jews. he didn't want to get that out because there was this anti-Semitic within America, within the Congress and so forth. And I wasn't aware of that. I just thought that doesn't seem to be possible. And I've always felt like that I understood Jewish people. I have an MD from Duke Divinity School, and I came away with a profound appreciation for the Judeo-Christian tradition. And within Duke, I mean, you've never heard anything really anti-Semitic at all, never, never. And so here I'm thinking, what is it like to be a Jewish person in the country in which you live? Because it seems to be that anti-Semitic type of attitudes are everywhere. And the last thing that just really surprised me, I read an article last night about the Ivy League colleges and how at the very beginning in the 20s, they excluded Jewish students. And it seems to continue even today. So my heart goes out to the Jewish person, but I realize, much like I've realized about the Black African-American, I don't know what it's like to be a Black African-American. I haven't the faintest idea, but I never had thought about what is it like to be a Jewish person. I realize now I don't have an idea as to what it's like.
Yeah, I mean, I do think this speaks to this kind of the warning that is contained also in this letter, right? The warning of deportation as a kind of like national cleansing strategy that is being employed, and that she says the representatives of Jews, especially the Zionist organization, isn't resisting. And then this ominous sentence on 129, one should never sign one's own death warrant, right? Which is obviously, she's not predicting what is to come, but she is very aware of the fact that the Zionist organization isn't a political representation of the Jewish people. And I think that is where her critique of these individualist strategies also comes in, right? The way that I read this passage about we should get rid of all those Jews who do not want to be Jews is you cannot organize politically around people who refuse to recognize their political agency as what they are, right? So political organization can only take place on the basis of a reality. And if that reality is denied, then that you cannot represent, so to speak. So she's connecting here her critique of parvenudom with these individual solutions, but interestingly also, I think she's saying that the Zionist organizations themselves are not political or not political enough. Peggy, you're mute.
Yeah, I just wanted to answer some of or elaborate on what the surgeon from Jackson asked. As a Jew in America, I'm 72, so I'm going back to experiences from my youth, more than recently. And there was prejudice expressed in many ways then. There was, for example, I grew up in the suburbs of New York, and up the street from me was a country club that did not admit Jews. there were social splits between Jews and non-Jews. There were areas in the suburbs of New York where Jews were not allowed to buy homes. This was post-World War II. I know some of the communities, there were restrictions on that. There were anti-Jewish attitudes, yes, and quotas in the Ivy League schools, in the professional schools, law school, med school. There were quotas, as I said. There was prejudice expressed to me as a student at the University of Michigan in 1967, where someone would not dare to go out for an evening with me because I was Jewish. Somehow they sensed that. My father was fighting anti-Semitism in business as he was running for office at a national company, but he persisted and he won. Also, what Hannah Arendt expressed about assimilation, well, beyond assimilation, into denial. That attitude existed in my youth towards fellow Jews, even though I was raised in a completely non-religious family that was around. The idea that you would deny your Judaism was seen as a kind of treachery. Actually, it was loathed. There was even a great deal of trouble, which you see in immigrant communities still, in dating or marrying outside of, not dating or marrying a fellow Jew. So I'm kind of surprised in Jackson, Mississippi, that you ran into none of this. However, it's, I think, revelatory to me, and I think brave of you to recognize that it's unimaginable to, you cannot imaginatively put on the shoes of a Jew or a Black American, and this is needed, that we can expand our I don't know, sympathetic understanding of others. And I guess I've said more than enough, so.
Thank you, Peg. Jeff?
Yeah, I wanted to come back to what you had brought up, Yana, which is the end of section 3, top of page 129. And well, I mean, I quoted the part about, you have to be a majority somewhere else, which then leads into the other repeated phrase, the trick of declaring the Jews a minority par excellence. This is not something that's going to work, she says. That this means that they're not a minority at all. And then you quoted, one should never sign one's own death warrant, which of course is especially spooky because it came true. But the top of that paragraph's got some facts in it, and we may not have them all here. I don't know. Some of the people want to read it, so it's always hard to do this. It seems like it's easy because you get a name, but maybe we can fill in the blanks from the context. I do not need to discuss at any length the most modern solution of the minority question, which consists of re-importation, much to the relief of states that have watched as minorities have been forced by their own majority to act politically and become a state within a state. And so you kind of have a handle on that, I'm not sure, and it's satisfying such minorities by gaining their agreement. Compare South Tyrol. Okay, well, there's a historical fact that we need to look up. Clearly demonstrates that under current circumstances, there appears to be no real solution to the question of nationality. And then I got underlined because I understood it. As for the Jews, these methods are dangerous because they cannot be re-imported to any mother. Well, actually, I don't totally understand it. These methods, maybe these are the methods that we don't know what they are. That's what my question is, because they cannot be re-imported to any motherland, to a state where they are a majority. So what are these methods that of called re-importation, whereby they were trying to handle the minority problem up until World War II?
I'm very interested in that as well.
You're talking out of turn.
Peggy, did you want to say something?
No, I'm on mute myself.
I mean, I think what happened was literally sort of like people were moved around to create ethnically clean in quotation marks, of course, states and regions after the First World War. So there is a kind of way in which the reality of the nation state before the First World War is not actually as an ethnically homogeneous construct. That is a creation of the governments and the main powers who decide to come up with the solution of the minority treaties and then move people around to create territories that are homogenous. And that leads, as you can imagine, to horrific problems shortly thereafter. Yeah.
I think you're right, because that explains forced by their own majority. They've been relocated, so now they're in the majority, and now they have politics. But it didn't work out. I mean, as you can imagine, but I'm not sure. I mean, obviously there'd be a lot of side problems, but does the actual strategy itself even pan out at all, or where does that go wrong? I mean, the side effects are going to be terrible, of course.
Excuse me, I have to leave, but I just wanted to say this as I'm listening to the conversation and the gentleman from majority Black city of Jackson, Mississippi, and I'm not quite sure I understand, how do you all feel in our discourse? And I know someone said earlier, people change, language changes. How do you feel when you hear women and other minorities might do such and such, such and such? So I'm sorry I have to leave at this point, but what is that, women and other minorities? We use it so freely right now. Has the language changed that much that the Hannah Arendt writing this in the 1940s would be shocked by that formulation? Sorry to jump in like that, but I'm going to have to leave soon. I'm curious to know what people are thinking, you women and other minorities on the phone.
Wait, I don't understand the question really. What?
Well, I'm telling you, that's the way it's used in the language, isn't it? It's coupled together.
You're objecting to the use of.
I'm not only objecting, I'm saying it's bizarre. It's bizarre. Are women minorities?
Who said women and other minorities?
Pick up your favorite liberal paper right now.
Okay.
And talking about our country, women and other minorities. That's why I prefaced my comment by saying maybe language has changed, but when did women become a minority, and how does this discourse that you're having right now, because I'm actually listening to this I'm not Jewish. I'm trying to understand what is in this discourse that has to do with me. And one thing it tells me is that we're all in a very confused world right now where you can say that women are a minority. And well, first of all, do you agree that women are a minority? Considering what Hannah is saying, but we use it all the time, right? Women's rights, women and other minorities. So am I the only one that finds that bizarre in light of what Hannah is writing?
I thought you mean the actual change of language. I think that we often say minority when we just mean oppressed. They may be a numerical slight majority actually, but they're not part of the patriarchy, of course.
Well, it's funny how it got there, isn't it? So who was crafting this language that allowed it to just slip and slide in such a sloppy way? Maybe we don't have our great distinction giver, Hannah Arendt, anymore. But it actually makes me angry that the language can be manipulated in that way, and that I even fall for it. But anyways, I thank you all very much. I'm going to another meeting. I'm directing a show right now that has to do with the shootings at the Mother Emanuel in Charleston and the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh by, quote, white supremacists. So it's a work about what it means to be a minority. And this is a new kind of a Holocaust that is being had right now. And in our national politics as well, because with election denial comes all of these questions as well. What will make America great? When was America great? Was there a time when America didn't have minorities and now it does? Is that what they mean? What do you think about that?
Thank you, Bill. Yeah, if you want to post a link to the production, if you have a website already, that would be great.
It wouldn't be very difficult to find. We will be the opening event at the Ronald Perelman Center at Ground Zero next fall. It's called Watch Night, the Ronald Perelman Center. Ironies on top of ironies, right? Okay, all right. Thank you all very much. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Bill.
Jeff, you're next, unless that's an old hand.
Could I say something? I don't know how to put my hand up.
Sure. If that's okay with you, Victus.
It's just a couple of thoughts that are sort of disparate. You know, this chronic question of what does it mean to be a Jew? You know, from the question of substance to the question of whatever that meant. And this exclusion of some Jews, because I know some Orthodox Jews, for example, say that to be a Jew, you have to observe the Sabbath in a particular way, sincerely. Otherwise, you're really not a Jew, which of course excludes a lot of us who, and even the question of you're a Jew if your mother was a Jew, but what if your grandmother was a Jew or your great-grandmother, but not your mother? I mean, I think it goes on. It's an endless question. Another thought I kept having about this sense of, you know, needing a state where you're a majority. So I'm sort of wondering, for example, how African countries, how have they been helpful in terms of racism in America and other places? How does that operate? And I think I can ask the same question about Israel. I'm not sure, for example, I really appreciated Pony's recounting of her experience growing up in suburban New York, which was very similar to mine growing up in Kansas City, of all places, which it was just, you know, you knew it was endless, the number of ways in which you were, quote, discriminated against. But how has the state of Israel helped address anti-Semitism in America? So it just makes me wonder about Hannah Arendt's, this particular idea of hers, that you need to be a majority someplace in order to fight the effects of minority status in other places.
That's a really good question, I think. Then the other question would be, how good of a representation of world Jewry is Israel?
Well, exactly, because I would say, for example, that because of the politics and the idea of it being a secular state is problematic for me as a Jew and as a Democrat, small d. And so I don't feel, for example, and I think many people probably feel this way, represented by Israel in terms of being Jewish or part of the Jewish people.
Victus, you were next.
Yes, I was in a way in the same line. I think Arendt also says that she thinks you can never get rid of social discrimination of the Jews, which is different in her view from political discrimination. So it's you have to have the political right as all the others in the state you live. But sadly enough, social discrimination, she thinks you can't get rid of. And I'm actually, if I'm honest, I'm quite afraid with inflation and maybe recession, this would go worse as times go by. No, because you have so many people, you have this upcoming in US, for instance, with white supremacy being more outspoken. And it is because people have a worse time to live in, and inflation, and they want to have someone to blame. And so that's a problem. What I was going to say was this, on page 132, what Arendt says there at the top. First, she says, in contrast to arrangements for minorities, the organization itself must above all preserve a context of solidarity for the people as a whole. Because within one country, a minority has a minority rule that just are valid within that country. So that won't give any solidarity for the Jews. And then she says in the middle, what such a national alliance stretching across all of Europe would look like in juridical terms, that is what concrete shape it would take, is still fairly enigmatic to my mind, though I pin great hopes on it. So she hasn't a clear idea how it would look. But then on the last paragraph there, she says, a worse political, indeed factual handicap will doubtless arise within our own ranks among American Jews, who in total naivete have inherited the role of the notables. And that makes these things together, makes me think that it is this Jews as a people, Jews as a nation, and that includes all Jews. I think she wants. So that's why if you have a European kind of Commonwealth-like organization or a European Union, that is not, I mean, there's a lot of Jews around in the world that won't be included in this. So that will always be a problem. So how do you do this? And I think it's a lot to me that says she hoped that the Jews all around would kind of unite and organize this kind of organized units in one way or another. But I also think she thought that the establishment of Israel as a nation state for the Jews, she didn't want that. And that made a lot of difference. And this is also what I think Susan said, no, the problem of being a Jew outside Israel and be judged by the politics of the Israelian. And the politics of the Israelian, no, is not a good politics towards Palestinians, what they do and how they treat them and occupy their territory or so on. So yeah, but I think she has this solidarity of the Jews as a nation and as a people, but she struggled with how can we do this? And I think she with the establishment of Israel, something changed, maybe not only for the good, maybe something for the good. And she didn't want it to be a nation state, which it ended up being.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There is a kind of problematization of the idea of land, right? Like when she speaks about the conundrum of a people without land in search of a land without people, that conundrum for her is not a real conundrum, right? The solution cannot be to give people a land that they can then belong to, and that sort of like affects their political representation, but it has to be guaranteed by a commonwealth. So it's kind of like a nation without land or a nation without sovereignty, which I think is a really interesting idea for us at this moment in time too, because we have the greatest refugee population since the Second World War at the moment, right? Like people just displaced all over the globe, and this idea of the nation state is still in crisis. It has continued to be in crisis since the 1940s, basically. Yeah, C. Nolan.
Yeah, unmuted. I apologize for kind of coming away from this brilliant discussion, but this is for Peggy Speckler, was that her name? I can't hear a lot of what you're saying, and it's not your fault, but I thought Peggy might be interested, and I believe Mr. Bill Jones would also, in addition to what I was talking about in Jackson, Mississippi, there was an interesting lecture, and it's called the Medgar Evers Institute lecture. And I don't know if you can see this or not. I think you probably can. This is the Galloway Memorial United Methodist Church in downtown Jackson. This was a Medgar Evers lecture. And if you see the gentleman that's sitting on the podium, that's Henry Louis Gates. And this was 2015. He was the lecturer. My wife and I went to the lecture just a few weeks ago. This was Isabel Wilkerson, who spent 15 years gathering documents for the publication of In the Warmth of Other Suns, in which she documented the migration of the African-American peoples within the South migrating to the North. And she spoke a fabulous presentation. And also she said she had gone to Africa and had talked to some Africans, and they said, we don't have any blacks in Africa. She mentioned the tribes, members of the tribes, but we don't have any blacks in Africa.
That? You're mute. You're mute, Jeff.
Thank you, whoever brought up the wiki article for the South Tyrol. I don't think it's necessary, and I gotta try and read it out here, but it just reminds you though of this. It was eerily familiar, because we're sort of heading into that now, even here where we don't have. Well, even more so. I mean, like, the red versus blue. It's like, is it by state? Well, no, it's like city and country. And like, how are we going to reorganize here? So they're really. But I wanted to sort of, bring up, and sort of maybe it's a good place to close. Is this what most of us were around reading Life of the Mind, right? And sort of getting a more aerial view of her anti-essentialism, right? This idea that okay, well, to be a people, we have to all be the same, and we do, and especially in the European context, we need to go back to where we started when we were together or something like that. Well, and they started as in separate countries, so then they want to go back to separate populations, that elbow to elbow, and then you have a parliament for that and so forth. But I think she's really. That's what the assimilation was attempted doing it, right? Okay, let's all invent another identity that we can all be, and clearly it didn't work. I don't know if she predicted it didn't work because she was living through its failure, I suppose. That doesn't work. That basically this is actually why we have to come to grips with plurality, because we are different, even if we want to be the same. We are different. We need to have, and democracy is the first best try anyway at finding a way that different people can live in the world together, right? Instead of creating their own separate little worlds, their own separate spheres of control. And we have exactly that problem now, because now the kind of divisions that are coming up are not really geographical. You could say it's the South versus the North kind of, but we're all far too mixed up to go with any kind of reversion to a fundamental situation where everybody is the same in a particular group. So this has been unexpectedly good. Thank you.
Hannah.
I was looking at JM, I don't know who that is, made a comment on the chat saying we don't do justice to the text as long as we don't know about the repercussions of deferred hopes for minorities after the Versailles Treaty and the 2 years that followed that Arendt refers to. She is at the core of the minority problem that can't be dealt with on a worldwide scale during these years. It'd be interesting to have that person like weigh in a little bit. But what I wanted to say just briefly was that I think it's so weird that she is talking about like some kind of European federation or whatever. And like the world is in complete, Europe is in complete disarray and in complete, you know, war. They're at war. There's no chance of federation at that point. So it just seems very weird to me that she's like, it's almost like so detached in a sense from the immediacy of what's happening in her world, which is, you know, she's sort of philosophizing about, you know, what's the way to treat minorities, but it's so unrealistic, right? I don't understand why she doesn't have this. Everything's falling apart in Europe as she's writing. Nobody's going to go around and create a federation, you know, because Germany is knocking off Belgium, Holland, France. Well, 1940s, that says when she writes it, May 10th, 1940 is when the Nazis invaded, bombed Holland and then Belgium, and then quickly thereafter took over Belgium, Holland, and went into France. So why does she write now about this, you know, these, it's a little weird to me. It's like, do you know what I'm saying?
We are out of time, but somebody asked me to ask Miriam if she wanted to say something. There was some parallel conversation very much on this topic going on in the chat, so.
Hi, yeah, that's me. I just can't find my hand button today. I don't know why it has disappeared. I have no hand. So apologies, but I just thought that the idea of the federation as she raises it was a way of trying to think of a structure that would prevent the coincidence of nation and state. As I said in the chat, that if a nation is a group of people who share a history, let's say.
I understand that. Yeah.
State is government, right? Then how to make them not coincide, because when they coincide, then you can have something like the Nazi regime, that where you're having essentially it's rule by tribe, rule by an ethnic group. So I think that Arendt is trying to imagine, you know, a structure that would be different. And the European Union, was that not created in order to avoid the kind of wars that were happening when Arendt was writing this?
I'm aware of that. Yeah.
I'm not responding to you directly.
Oh, right.
That comment was
Sure, sorry. Okay, guess there's no point in commenting.
Peggy, do you want to have the last quick word?
Yes, a couple of things. There are, I know of at least two sort of religion. Well, one is a religion and one is a kind of religion that are non-exclusive. One is the Baha'i faith, and the other is ethical culturalism, which I was raised in. So there are examples of alternatives. That's for Jeff. And then I just had another example in an instance in my own life to add to my maybe boring litany of before, but that trope about Jewish money-mindedness and greed, that I encountered among some faithful Christians a couple of years ago, and it disrupted a sort of social network. So it's not over. the stereotyping and the prejudicial, constructs, they're alive. So I'm sorry, that's probably not a good way to end. Maybe someone can end.
Well, we will continue to
way.
think about them, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for all attending, and for bearing with me in shuffling our participation strategies and our discussion a little bit. Thanks for being flexible. And I believe next week Roger is back. And then we will be reading more about the Jewish army.